Welcome back, everyone. We're ready for our discussion to begin, our presentations to begin. We're so happy to have artists from around the world joining together with us this evening. This presentation that we're going to see came about because of the great collaborations ASBA has been enjoying through our exhibition, Abundant Future, Cultivating Diversity in Garden, Farm, and Field, the New York Botanical Gardens' 4th Triennial. Its theme is crop diversity, a topic that couldn't be more timely. The exhibition features 40 original artworks of plants we all rely on, most of them heirloom crops or crop wild relatives. Each artwork in the exhibition tells a story about the value of our botanical heritage and how we and others shepherd it as we live our daily lives. ASBA is devoted to perpetuating the practice of botanical art and through its outreach to promote awareness of the role plants play in our lives. One of the ways we achieve these goals is through our exhibitions program and through this triennial exhibition produced with NYBG. We were really excited about the potential power of these artworks to spark a new way of looking at plants people interact with every day. The exhibition will be traveling through 2023. First to Tucson Botanical Garden in Tucson, Arizona, then to the Lee Yawkey Woodson Art Museum in Wausau, Wisconsin, and then to the Denver Botanic Gardens in Denver, Colorado. Bringing stories like this to the public is one way in which we fulfill our mission. We knew the theme would also challenge our artists, and for some would present a steep learning curve about what exactly qualifies as an heirloom or what is a crop wild relative. ASBA provided some resources, but artists had to go out and make their own connections and do their own research to find suitable subjects. In this case, artists are not just inspired by the aesthetic attributes of their subject, but they're taken down a road where they learn about their subject's history and the ways in which it might be relevant to contemporary global issues. We encourage relationship building between artists and those in other disciplines, whether it be horticulture, science, history, or art. And this presentation tonight is a good example of this. I want to first thank our 4 presenters who will be giving us all food for thought tonight about the plants we rely on for survival. Each is working on a different aspect of crop diversity, sustainability, and food security. Each will use artworks from ASBA's traveling exhibition, Abundant Future, as a springboard to talk about some of the work they're doing, from identifying crop wild relatives that can serve as a backup for their cultivated cousins, to creating new varieties of edibles that expand our food palette and build on our inherited plant diversity. If you have any questions in the audience, just type them into the Q&A, and we'll get to as many of them as possible at the close of the presentations. ASBA board member and artist Susan Minton will be moderating the Q&A. So first, I'd like to give you a little background on each of our presenters in the order in which they're going to appear tonight. Colin Curry is the Senior Director of Science and Conservation at the San Diego Botanic Garden, a 37-acre garden in Encinitas, California, working to conserve plants and educate people about the wonders of plant life. He is also a visiting scientist at the International Center for Tropical Agriculture in Cali, Colombia. Colin's core interest is conservation and access to biodiversity for people and for the planet. Alex Wenger is a seed grower, farmer, and plant breeder whose passion is sustainability through food, plants, and agriculture. His research farm is engaged in many long-term activities, such as breeding disease-resistant apple varieties through crosses with wild apples from Central Asia, and developing Apios Americana as an alternative food crop. He raises specialty grains and vegetables organically for chefs in Lancaster, New York City, and Philadelphia. Alex has been using traditional plant breeding to stabilize and revive regional crop land races as well. Recently, he completed his MS in sustainable food systems, where his thesis focused on agrobiodiversity conservation and endangered crop land races. Sorry, I didn't change the slide to Alex. There's Alex. I can only do one thing at a time. Allison Miller is a professor in the Department of Biology at St. Louis University and a member and principal investigator at the Danforth Plant Science Center. She is a research associate at the Missouri Botanical Garden. Her research program focuses on understanding evolution and plasticity in perennial crops and emerging perennial candidates for domestication. Michael Mazurek is the Calvin Noyes Keeney Associate Professor of Vegetable Breeding at Cornell University and a breeder of peas, beans, squash, cucumbers, and peppers. Michael's specialty is biochemical genetics in vegetables. He explores the diverse phytochemistry that plants use to repel pests and herbivores, reward and nourish pollinators and seed dispersers, and cope with environmental stresses, with a goal of harnessing to maximize nutrition and sustainability. Michael shares the craft of plant breeding with students at Cornell through grower conferences and field days, and remotely through Also Seeds. Michael is a pro bono co-founder of Row 7 Seeds to advance a goal of helping public and freelance plant breeders share their creations with a public that seeks choice and diversity in their food. So now we'll go to Colin.
Good afternoon, good evening, good night, and good morning. It sounds like there's folks from all over the world, which is incredibly exciting. I hope that you can hear me and that you can see my slideshow. Let me know if that's not true. Thanks. So I'm honored to be among these four panelists, really truly to be here and get the chance to speak with you about our thoughts about your art, and hoping that that will be also interesting and helpful for you. I'm a plant scientist and a conservationist here at the San Diego Botanic Garden. Please come visit us anytime in San Diego if you're out here. I have an appreciation for botanical art and its role in conservation. I have very little aptitude in art, I think, myself. And so I also have that the grass is greener, wishing that I was a better artist and wishing I could be among you as more of a peer. I think that among us four, we share some common appreciation about this art, appreciation for it as art itself and for its importance. I think you'll also see that we're all struck differently by the art. And so this presentation of mine will provide my perspective on what I see within this art, starting with this piece, which is a beautiful display by Ji Young-Koo of rice and variation in color and morphology in the diversity of rice of one species. And for me, this piece already speaks a lot about time and about change over time, which one can also see in the title, Revival After 100 Years, which is an interesting time period to choose. These last 100 years have been, by many accounts, a time of the most change that has ever happened within, let's say, 100 years within crop diversity and agriculture. And so I think it's a very apropos title. It makes me think about time. And so I will go back much further to start my presentation, really to the beginnings of agriculture 10,000 plus years ago, where around the world, many different people, many different cultures were innovating. They were seeing the plants around them, also animals, and liking them and entering into a relationship of interdependence or codependence with those plants. And those plants, of course, changed through those processes. This is a series of pieces that I've just always loved by Peggy Duke of the origins of many different crops around the world. And she did one for fruits, as you see in that big picture. She did one for vegetables, one for cereals. on and on. In my own science, I tried to put this together into one map, not of every crop in the world, but of many of our most important, which is certainly not as beautiful artistically, but a little bit more concentrated in one place. And I was looking at this for a variety of reasons about conservation and about what food we eat now and where it comes from in the past. I think that this piece hopefully inspires a lot of different thinking. It has. I've been really excited that this has ended up on many teachers' walls in classrooms and in other places because it provides a number of different messages, that there's diversity all over the world, that agriculture didn't start in just one place, that there's been innovators over time for many thousands of years that have contributed to the foods that we eat and produce all over the world. What this background for me gives me is perspectives on pieces of art like this beautiful piece by Sally Petru on sorghum. It is not only beautiful to look at as this elegant cereal, but also knowing that this plant comes from a place, that it comes from East Africa, what's now mostly known as Sudan and South Sudan, and people there from 5,000 years ago, moving up to the present in some unbroken chain of working with plants and improving them and moving them around and sharing them with others. Another piece that makes me think a lot is this just incredibly beautiful piece by Jean Edmonds on eggplants. And a number of aspects come up here for me besides just the beauty and the incredible colors and variations. One is that, and this may be striking for some folks, we actually don't know where some of the crops that are the most important crops that we eat, where they really come from. And eggplants are one of those. That there's still a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of thoughts that they probably came from South, Southeast, or East Asia, but that's quite a big region of the world, and it's really uncertain. Another aspect here that's seen is that there are not only different varieties of eggplants, but different species of eggplants here. And it starts to tell the story, which is more and more true the more one digs, that this interesting story that people very often didn't just domesticate one species, but a whole set of plants that were related to each other. So a number of different eggplants in this case, a number of different species of squash here in the Americas, or beans. And that's very interesting. It makes me wonder about what it was about those plants that were so attractive, different cultures in different parts of a region or of the world who kept looking at them and kept working with them. In this case, this is 2 species of eggplants. Now that diversity did come from places, many places around the world, but it's also spread. And that's been the story of the last 10,000 years, spread across the world. You may know this set of paintings by Giuseppe Arcimboldo, an Italian artist. One of the incredible things about this piece is, for me, is that this is less than 100 years after Columbus contacted the New World. And already in this piece, one sees plants that come from the New World embedded in a painting of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II in Europe. There's literally ears of corn and hearts of squash and chili peppers. And that's pretty amazing to me. It doesn't take that long to be adopted into a new culture, a useful plant, and to become seen as even part of the body that is so important. One of the pieces from this set that makes me think a lot about this is this beautiful piece from Gillian Rice of I'itoi onions. I worked and lived in Arizona, including with the Tohono O'odham people. And so this piece, of course, connects personally to me. But it also is an interesting story because these onions, so this is a variety, a Native American variety, one could say, but these onions are not native to the Americas or not to the Southwest. They were brought by the Spanish from probably the missionaries, and those peoples in the desert Southwest adopted them in, changed them, adapted them, and they've become part of the culture and of the lexicon there. I should mention that I think that there's an incredible amount of positive and beauty to these stories of travels and adoption. It's not an entirely benign story, I would say. Those contributions, have their difficulties and challenges as well. apparently this picture, which I'm going to go back to in a minute, I was reading about more recently, and one of the interpretations of this picture was that Rudolph II, it was a display of how incredibly powerful this person and this empire was, and the ability to take over other cultures, in showing that there was plants from all over the world that were incorporated into his body. Through this mixing and matching of plants and animals around the world, we are deeply interconnected. This is a hopelessly complicated figure from my own science. I would hopefully call it art in some strange form, that shows simply different regions around the world and where plants come from, their origins, where they were domesticated, and where they are now important to be eaten in this case. This is in terms of calories of what feeds us. But also I did a similar work for where we produce food and where it comes from. What it shows is that we're incredibly interconnected all over the world, from plants and their domestications in the past and are present right now. This is reflected in our art, of course. This is the famous self-portrait from Van Dyck. It has a sunflower in it, and the sunflower is a crop from my part of the world. Being a person, I should mention I'm at the San Diego Botanic Garden, but I'm also coming more from the Midwest and from the Colorado region more recently, and sunflowers are native to that region. They were domesticated in that region. And this is just a really neat painting for me for many reasons. Sunflowers were brought very early on back to Europe, and they already adopted a meaning in the painting and in the art. And I'm sure that many of you know this better than I do, but what I know from a little bit of reading is that sunflowers, because they move with the sun, have some symbolic connection or meaning, that they're shining positively on what they're looking at. And so this is a self-portrait of a plant, literally saying that the subject is appreciated or beautiful in some sense, and that's quite powerful. Moving back to that 100 years of change, this last 100 years, there has also been a tremendous disappearance or loss of this diversity, this thousands of years of innovation that has come through all of the big mega changes of the world, of economic and agricultural change, of urbanization, of globalization, of demographic change, all of that stuff coming together. Very complicated to understand, very complicated to work against as a conservationist. This is the national seed bank that we have here in the United States. There are seed banks or gene banks like this around the world that are working to preserve this diversity in an arc-like sense in its time where it is really disappearing. There's also a global version of this that I've been honored to be part of. This is up in the Arctic Circle. It's called the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, and its entrance is a piece of art in and of itself that was chosen to celebrate this, this global repository for seeds from around the world that are buried after a very long tunnel that you enter through that art piece deep in this mountain. It's also increasingly recognized that this ARC work that we're doing is not enough, that crop diversity still needs to be out there in the world, evolving with pests and diseases, with climate change, and also because it's so important to human cultures and to their self-determination. And so this is a work that I've been working on, and another of the panelists, Dr. Miller, is also part of trying to understand change over time by returning to places like this field in the Hopi country in Arizona in the United States, to the same farmers and the same families decades later, and understanding through conversations with them how this diversity has changed over time and what we can do to support conservation. My final point is that this conservation work we're doing is not just about crops and their diversity, but also about wild species that are related to crops, the so-called crop wild relatives, a grammatically incorrect but useful term. This is a beautiful also painting in my eyes from Jane Hancock. This is a wild relative of plums, and it grows all over around Colorado, also where I've recently relocated from. And a lot of my work these days as a bit of an expert in this field is trying to understand these plants, like the wild sunflowers that grow in Wyoming and Colorado, or wild apples that grow in this case in the pine forests on the East Coast in Florida, and seeing what we can do to conserve them both in their natural habitats and again in the arcs of the gene banks. Thank you so much. I look forward to any questions, and I'm going to hand it over.
Thank you so much, Colin. We're going to move to Alex Wenger now, and we look forward to hearing what Alex has to say. Any questions, type them into the Q&A button. They'll be answered at the end of all 4 talks.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here. I'll assume that I'm loud enough unless I hear otherwise. Feel free to interrupt if anyone has issues hearing me. Carol, can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Great. All right. So let me, I can't access the screen start without closing Zoom here for a second. I apologize. All right, so I'm coming to you from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where I was born and raised, and I love this illustration and work of art to begin my portion of the presentation because pawpaws are a part of the landscape here. This is North America's largest native fruit, and you can find them in the woodlands along the Susquehanna River and waterways and rocky ground that was too steep to be farmed. Monica DeVries did this beautiful image of what the fruit looks like when it's ripe and ready to harvest. And my grandparents 100 years ago had pawpaw trees in their backyards, on their farms, and yet my introduction to pawpaws came far later when an elder from our community walked me into pawpaw groves for the first time because he didn't want knowledge about these fruits to be lost. And so we live in an anthropogenic landscape where humans have impacted every surface of landmass and have impacted plant and animal communities. And much like Colin said, the idea of something being wild might not be totally accurate anymore. And in the case of pawpaws, they began as mastodon food and were selected by humans in recent times to be much meatier. And so breeders beginning in the 70s approximately began selecting wild pawpaws. And when you harvest wild pawpaws, you can have the ones I just tested today were 16 to 25% seeds by weight. So 100 pounds of fruit, if you had 25% seed to flesh ratio, 25% of your harvest, 25 pounds would be all seeds. And breeders, by intermating and selecting the largest, have reduced that number to 3%, 4%, 8%. So in a very short period of time, we've taken something that is still available to us because a few of our elders and eaters remembered it and made an effort to conserve it and have done something really beautiful with it to where now it's poised to be a commercial crop. And we do a lot of work with restaurants and chefs trying to come up with recipes that maybe my grandparents didn't enjoy the mango and banana and jackfruit sort of taste that the right paw fruit has, but chefs who can turn it into ice cream or frozen yogurt or caramels and pastry creams can deliver a different experience that will get folks excited about this plant and allow it to become a commercial crop again. Another wild plant that has a lot of potential as an alternative food crop is Apios Americana. It is a legume in the pea and bean family that's native to the eastern United States. And it's another example of where a wild or a plant that's not intensively selected by people has existed with us to the point where breeders were able to collect samples from many states across the East and Midwestern United States and even Canada, and began a breeding program at Louisiana State where they took wild plants that had tubers the size of a dime and increased them to approaching potato size and yield, which is pretty incredible for less than 10 years of breeding work and not that much funding in the grand scheme of which crops get a lot of R&D support from our government. And why is this important? Apios Americana has between 14 and 16% protein in the highest selections. It has a unique amino acid profile and few pests and diseases, just like pawpaws, because it is native to where we live and to these climates. And so it has all the makings of a crop that can diversify our the 10 or 12 staples that most of us eat as the majority of our diet. It's one of the 10,000 other plants that is edible and delicious and nutritious. And with a little bit of work, we can get it there. And a chef had a really great idea. Instead of boiling tubers like some of the botanical records show, why don't we shred them and treat them like coconut so we can use them in cakes and pastries, or try making a nut milk kind of drink with them like horchata, to take something that might resemble a potato to a consumer and change your perspective about what you're eating to tell the story of this plant. So you'll see some selections that we made from true seed on our farm on the upper left-hand corner. These were where we planted seeds from this plant in March, transplanted them in plastic mulch in May, and by November we were digging up the roots to see which were large enough to keep, which would be discarded. And in our case, the discards went to restaurants to try and get feedback from folks who are professionals at understanding flavor and texture, to give us some repertoire to introduce this plant to others. And it's worth mentioning that we took this to Oregon in 2016 for the Culinary Breeding Network showcase, and the chef that we were paired with, his grandmother was Pennsylvania Dutch, like my family, and from Michigan. And she remembered eating Apios as a famine food and had recipes that she had shared with him. So I think often the idea that crops are wild gets broken down when we see a more complex picture. And I love this picture of the red stalker corn by Albina Heron, because we also grow a red corn. That's a really nice example of adapting crop land races to farm conditions. So we have 40 acres in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. About 9 are in crop and seed production. And we plant an acre or two of this corn every year. It was said to make the world's best polenta, which is a food that's really special to me, growing up with my grandma who made Pennsylvania Dutch cornmeal mush. And so when I heard it was near extinct in northern Italy, and there's a food historian bringing seeds to the US, it was like, wow, I'd love to grow this. And what happens when you plant a crop that's been preserved in gardens and on a small scale. In this case, this is one of several corns that was grown in the Valsugana Valley in northeastern Italy, and was selected and adapted to that region for several hundred years after maize came from the New World to northern Italy. And yet in the last 100 years, we have had a lot of changes in our food supply to where folks were not keeping the seeds anymore. So this survived, this strain that we grow of this corn, there's several, but ours is called Floriani for the family that kept it. And yet, because it was kept in a garden with a small amount of plants, when we increased it to an acre in size, we had about 10% of the stalks that didn't fall down when they were mature. And so we had to do a lot of selection for stronger stalks, for husks that covered the ears and that turned down at harvest, because we have a very wet, humid climate, so we don't develop mold. And so it had all this potential to be a food stuff in our area, but it needed to be translated to the challenges that farmers face in the present. And this is another beautiful example. We had some friends who are Hmong from Laos who came to Lancaster County as refugees, and they came to forage our bamboo crop one spring, and we'll usually harvest 1,000 pounds of shoots. And we began doing that because this family found out we had bamboo and was on it. Bamboo is like having a morel patch. You don't tell anyone in the community about it because it's such a treasured spring food. And as a thank you, she brought these corn seeds with her. And this is the Hmong Paku corn, which is a group of glutinous or waxy maize varieties that are disappearing in Southeast Asia. And I had been reading academic articles about this plant and how there was a conservation effort, and she handed me these seeds because they were part of her family and food tradition, and she kept them across 3 continents till she came to Lancaster County. And I think the story of farmers and gardeners and intensive smallholders is the other term, who are producing a lot of food on a really small scale, not big enough to be a classic farm, but big enough to make an impact on our food system. For my master's thesis, we found in 3 gardens that were exceptionally diverse, there were over 130 crop varieties and almost 50 that were not available commercially, that were saved by these growers because they were important to their culture. And what we do on a larger scale, as far as the research on our farm, is that we use a lot of techniques like back cross breeding. And so the Edinburgh potato by Lizzie Sanders is a nice story of where you take a cultivated and a wild crop relative and intermate the two to try and get the best of both worlds. And so in the center of your screen, you'll see a chart from an apple breeding program where a wild apple and a cultivated type were cross-pollinated to get scab resistance to a devastating apple disease. And the upper right-hand corner is some peaches that we were working on. So over the course of several generations, you have these wild kind of shrubby small fruits, and you keep recrossing them with cultivated varieties to introduce the traits for color, size, and flavor. And so there's a native variety, or I'm sorry, a local landrace of peach that we did this with as well. It's in the center of your screen. It's small, yellow, but extremely brown rot resistant. And we got all these incredible shapes, sizes, colors, and possibilities for other farmers in our region, which are now on trial for us to evaluate to decide which ones we might use in future crosses. And to the last point in this slideshow, I love this chart illustration by Mitsuko Schultz, because chard is an example of a plant that has been so heavily selected for one feature. In this case, its leaves and its stalks, but botanically, it's exactly the same crop, Beta vulgaris, as beets, which are grown for their roots. And so brassicas are how this comes to fruition on our farm, because we use lots of leafy greens like mizunas in our salad mix, especially in the fall and winter. So you'll see some images of cross-pollinations where we have colorful mizunas and winter hardy mizunas that have been allowed to intermate. And in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, that looks like one of our mizunas, and yet it's from one of the gardens that I surveyed during my master's thesis. So on all scales of growing, when people begin keeping seeds, you see things from the past as you adapt crops to the present and the future. And what struck me this week as I planted salad is that when we came to our property, my grandparents sold their homestead, we moved to where we live now, and the first act that my grandpa did was to spread turnip seed everywhere. My grandpa called him my father called my grandpa Johnny Turnip Seed because he got a 50-pound sack and planted it any open ground there was. And his tradition taught him that brassicas improve the soil. And I don't think that he could have imagined that our brassicas would look and taste and act the way they do, and that we're getting all these incredible colors over the winter. And yet we plant them much in the same way at the same time of year to improve the soil. And our best fields are where we've grown Brassica rapa. And so we're both planting the same crop, but with different modifications that have been made through selection. And so the more diversity we can keep in gardens, in wild spaces, and I think in artwork too, like the ones that all of you have created, for some that might be the first taste of a pawpaw, the idea that there is such a fruit. And I think having those ideas and conversations is incredibly important, whether you're a farmer, gardener, artist, policymaker, or consumer or chef. We need to have those images and those stories and memories as part of our culture, or those crops will disappear. And I think that's what's the most powerful point to all these illustrations you've created, is they're sharing that message with the world.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was so fascinating. And now we move on to Allison Miller.
All right, thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I'm coming to you from St. Louis, Missouri. I will note my son just started his trumpet lesson, so if you hear something in the background, that's what it is. So it's just a delight to follow Colin and Alex tonight. And I want to underscore a point that they've made so far, which is that all of our crops, everything that we eat, comes from what were once wild plant populations. So this is an image I took at the Konza Prairie in the central Kansas. It's full of a bunch of long-lived plants and a bunch of short-lived plants. And one of the things that I think botanical illustration, botanical art does for me at least, is to remind me of the inherent beauty of the natural world, and that it is, in fact, the foundation of everything that we eat, and it will be everything that we develop moving forward. So my research program is focused on long-lived plants, perennial plants, and they make up a relatively minor portion of our diets relative to shorter-lived plants, annual plants. But I want to draw our attention to these long-lived plants tonight and tell you a little bit about how interesting and important they are and how beautiful they are in botanical art. So one quick point of clarification is that there are actually two categories of long-lived crops. There are the woody perennial crops. These are things like grapevines and fruit and nut trees, things that have largely a single stem or a small shrubby life form. And that's what we're going to be talking most about tonight. But there's a second category of perennial crops, and those are the herbaceous perennial crops, things that are more grass-like or bean-like in nature. And these herbaceous perennial species, although they are abundant in nature, were rarely taken into cultivation by early farmers, but they're playing an increasingly important role, particularly in sustainable agriculture. So I just wanted to highlight that group. And although we won't be able to talk about it today, I hope that you'll keep your eye out. All right, so I'd like to start by looking at this really beautiful illustration by Sarah Howard of the plant that I tend to start my day with, and is probably true for many people on this call, coffee plant, Coffea arabica. So this is a perennial, long-lived plant that is grown, as probably know, all over the world. I've seen it in Central America, where it's actually become an important, and coffee plantations have been an important pathway for biodiversity conservation, as coffee growers often like to grow large trees to shade their coffee plantations. And those trees can be important resources, not only for plant biodiversity, but animal biodiversity as well. So this illustration, and particularly of the coffee beans and the seeds that are within them, reminds me that most annual or short-lived crops are grown from their seeds. Seeds are planted and then grow over the course of a year and then are harvested at the end. And most coffee plants are still grown from their seeds, but really an unusual feature, and one that I think is really biologically important, of perennial woody crops, many other ones, not coffee, is that they are clonally propagated. One that reminds me of this is this picture of the Portuguese quince by Margaret Best. So the quince is a member of the rose family. There are many crops that come from the rose family, and many of those perennial woody fruit trees are clonally propagated. And I've really appreciated over the years how botanical illustrators have captured the unique variation of these clonally propagated varieties. And we know that there has been a decrease in the number of varieties of clonally propagated plants, particularly as more popular or easily propagated, or whatever it is, rise in popularity. All right, so another perennial favorite, as it were, there are many species in the genus Ficus, like this Ficus punctata by Iniki Nugroho, that are propagated, grown from cuttings as well. Now, something that this image reminds me of is that many species in the genus Ficus, the fig genus, have been taken into cultivation. And this is a really important hallmark of many of our woody, long-lived crops. It's not just a single species that has made its way into what we call the domestication pipeline. In fact, it's many different species. And this is one example of those species. And so when we think about illustrating, highlighting agrobiodiversity, crops and their wild relatives, it's actually that many of these crops are are quite diverse and have made it into cultivation all over the world. All right, so next I'd like to go to one of my favorites, the genus Vaccinium. This is the cranberry and blueberry genus. This image was drawn by Connie Scanlon. This is one of the relatively few numbers of species that have entered the domestication from wild species here in North America and in the North Temperate Zone. It's another genus in which multiple species have been domesticated, and it's one that I think we're seeing increasing innovation on and interest in as we move forward. So I'd like to spend the rest of my brief time tonight talking about one of my all-time favorite genera of plants, the grapevine genus, the genus Vitis. This is a genus that includes about 60 species. This lovely rendition of the wild fox grape Vitis labrusca by Betsy Rogers Knox is just one of 19 grapevine species that are native here in North America. There's one native to Europe and about 37 native to Asia. Now, this is a common feature of our North American flora here in Missouri. We have 8 species in the genus. Now, although the bulk of grapevines that are cultivated for wine and for table grapes are derived from the European species Vitis vinifera, I want to highlight a bit tonight about the role that these native grapevines play, not only in North American viticulture, but in global viticulture. And what I'd like to try to convince you of is that they're kind of hidden uses and applications of naturally occurring agrobiodiversity that we might not think of that often. So I mentioned I start my day with coffee. Many of us may end our day with the grapevine genus here with wine. So let's go to California and take a look at, this is a Cabernet Sauvignon in the Central Valley. California is the main grower of grapes in the United States, although certainly not the only one. And we're seeing huge expansions of grape growing here in my neck of the woods in the Midwest and even in the East Coast. But when we look at a grapevine, it's actually much more than meets the eye. So here on the far right is an image of the kind of the base of the grapevine stem. And you can see that there's a knot here kind of in the middle. And what that is the point at which 2 different entities were physically grafted together, 2 different species in many cases. And this is the case for many clonally propagated woody crops, and certainly for nearly all grapevines that are growing here in North America and in Europe and other parts of the world. So the way grafting works is it is a horticultural manipulation that surgically fuses together 2 different vines. And so a special cut is made that helps join these 2 different vines. In this case, these are 2 different species of grapevines. They are wrapped together with parafilm. This is me dipping one of these grafts into wax. They're allowed to heal. This is the tool that's actually used to make the cut. And this is how our grapevines are constructed. So when we look at a single vine, what we're actually looking at is usually the top part of the plant, which horticulturalists refer to as the scion, which is usually a European species, but sometimes is a hybrid between a European species and any number of North American species. One example of this is a local grapevine, Chamberson, which actually has 6 different North American grapevines in its background. We can then go to the lower half of this perennial crop equation, which people refer to as the rootstock, and realize that this rootstock is in most cases derived from one of 3 different native North American vines or their hybrid derivatives. So agrobiodiversity in the context of a single vine is really quite complex. And for this reason, any type of connections that we can help people make with the native variation that really, it's the roots of the whole global grape crop is absolutely critical. All right, so I wanted to just share some of the ongoing work and challenges that we're facing as we try to adapt viticulture and other long-lived perennial crop systems for changing climates. So we've been working here in Missouri, we've been working in California, in different places around the Midwest and East Coast, and then even with some new experimental vineyards that we're setting up across the country. And one of the things we're trying to learn is, what is it that makes grapes that have the characteristics that they have, and how does that change over the course of a season? And how do these different root systems in particular that are, again, derived from different species affect those vines? So to do this, we set up an experiment in which we manipulated the root systems. These different numbers are just different root systems derived from different wild species. And we grafted them all to the same thing. So the tops of the plants are all the same and the bottoms are all different. And then we collected data over the course of 3 years, 3 different time points. And I just want to give a brief summary of what we found, which is that the root systems to which grapevines are grafted affects every aspect of the biology of the vine, going from the shapes of the leaves to the microbes that we see in the fruits to the chemistry of the wine. And this is something that we are struggling to help the general public and just folks everywhere understand the incredible variation that these native plant species can impart even to a crop that is so familiar to so many people. And we really believe that this natural variation has an important role to play as we attempt to adapt viticulture for changing climates. And we think this work may have some insights for other clonally propagated perennial crops as well. Okay, so I'd like to just end there and say that we are so delighted to be able to learn more about botanical art and to think about how we can connect our agricultural systems with the natural ecosystems that produced the crops that we use today, and that will almost without doubt help us adapt these systems for the future. All right, thanks so much. And I am going to pass it off to Michael.
Well, thanks, Allison. And I have to get out of the mode of just listening to all this great information here. And I gotta try to get to my buttons around the Zoom. So the point for me, I'm a plant breeder, a vegetable breeder, and one of the great joys of what I get to do is remix genetic diversity, to explore, to create, to discover. And you'll see some of my creations appear in seed catalogs if you're looking for something new for next season. But maybe you grow heirlooms, you'll see something that one of my academic professional ancestors was working on decades or more ago. What I'm focusing on in a lot of the work I do for the joy of the work I do is remix, where we can try to change color and flavor and size and patterns and taste. And with the idea that in doing this, I can help vegetables better compete with processed foods, try to help people to be able to be naturally drawn to eat their veggies, to entice them in. One of the biggest barriers I have to that as we try to create this novelty, diversity to draw people in, is getting this into the marketplace. If you go to the grocery store, in many cases, you'll be confronted by these walls of conformity. Peppers, for example, here as commodities where they will be imported from all different parts of the globe and all need to look the same to fit in this industrialized process where there's just these cubes that continue to march along the produce aisle shelves. With And whenever you see this, whenever you see things starting to look the same, that tells you you're having genetic erosion. Once you have uniformity, you're losing diversity, you're locking things into certain aesthetics. And when you're locking it into an aesthetic, that's probably the least important thing to strive for in improving our food system. Okay. So, in thinking about then the value of some of this genetic diversity and where we're going, it's fall harvest season in my part of the world here in New York. And so we're having pumpkins and corn mazes. And one way to think about genetic diversity for me is if you were to navigate this corn maze and you just get one shot, you're going to make the right call, of course, at all the turns. And you're going to proceed directly to the goal, to the finish line. Well, that's probably not going to happen. We're going to hit dead ends. We're going to want to come back, change our minds, make a different choice of which way to turn. And genetic diversity, and especially conserving that genetic diversity, for me is what allows me to go back and say, what could I do differently now that I know what I know now? Right? An example that I think many of us can relate to here, Asuki Hishiki's heirloom tomato. We've been tremendous at this industrial tomato production where we get these pink, crunchy, flavorless, but cheap spheres in the grocery store. But is that really what we wanted? Where's the nutrition? Where's the flavor? This tomato, I'm sure is, I can almost smell it's fragrant and luscious. And this is probably the tomato with the most nutrition and the most enjoyable to eat. You see a lot of plant breeders now looking at a do-over to recover flavor. And luckily, we've preserved the genetic diversity for that. Right? Another example here in Sangwon An's zucchini, a lesson here. So zucchini was domesticated in northern Mexico. Well, the predecessor of zucchini was, because then it made it to Europe, and it was the Italians that developed it into zucchini. It was reintroduced to the world outside of Italy in the early 1900s, and it's one of the most widely grown squashes in the world. Fantastically popular, fantastically common, really took over as a market class. But when you grow it in other parts of the country and the world, you get some challenges. So pardon, I'm going to show you the least appealing photo of the night. Is one of the challenges, especially we have here on the East Coast, are striped cucumber beetles. It's an insect pest that these have evolved specifically to go after plants in the zucchini, in the squash family, the Cucurbitaceae. One of the ones they love is zucchini. They even love the flowers as well, as I think so many of the artists and the chefs do as well, unfortunately. But this isn't our only option. Another independent domestication happened in the southeastern US, where the yellow squash, the crookneck, the straight neck squash were independently domesticated right where this insect pressure is. And you can see side by side on the right, these plants are grown side by side. The insects leave these squash alone. These squash have evolved resistance to the insects. They can defend, look out for themselves. So there's choices in the diversity we make and what to grow and consume that can really affect sustainability. And choices to go back and maybe recover flavors people liked and combine it with more sustainable attributes. And if you're just thinking about squash, those summer squashes, you're really scratching the surface on all of the Cucurbitaceae family that's consumed all over the world. So here, Laura Gastinger's Mexican sour gherkin is just one example, a fantastic one though. If you haven't tried them, they're these little morsels you put in your mouth and they pop when you bite them. It's a delight. Just to get the conversation going around. So what are all the missed opportunities in some of the foods that people eat around the world that we're not eating that might be more sustainable if we look to see how they perform in our region? Okay. Another crop that I work with is peppers. Janine Walke's, Jimmy Nardello, is a fantastic depiction of this sweet Italian frying pepper that has this distinctive shimmy to it. You can see the undulations of it, and you know you have a Jimmy Nardello. It is delicious. It's a darling of chefs' culinary magazines. But there's some challenges when you get into the kitchen, if it is really this unruly on the table. And there's things to do for me to make it produce more and more quickly where I am in New York. And we started to conceptualize where we're going to go with this. So what would the final product look like? This was the beginning of my collaboration with an artist, Ruby, the Elysiotropta, where as I started to describe what we're trying to make, Ruby started to paint and represent some of the different peppers, how she thought they might turn out. And so that I could express to other people what it was I was doing, what I was trying to create. And this first pepper, when I first saw it, I was like, that's exactly it. That is a uniform, straight, clean, candy apple red pepper. I was sure this was my pepper. However, Ruby kept going and had another depiction of a pepper that once I saw it, I had to admit, well, this is actually quite a bit more interesting. In part, it preserves an homage in the shape to the Jimmy Nardello pepper with the curve at the top near the stem. So it helps to stand out, to be able to distinguish it from many of the other peppers that you might otherwise have in the produce aisle. Okay. And for this one, so if you would like to play this game with me, how it works is there's a yellow pepper seed on the center of this pepper. You can blink, but don't look away. You stay focused on the yellow pepper seed as I talk. So in one of the things as I am trying to create new plants, mixing and matching diversity, creating things that haven't really existed before, trying to conceptualize what they're looking like. What are we trying to create? We haven't seen these before, but we want to try to, in our mind's eye, get an idea of what they could be. Talking to people about if you'd want change, what change would it be? And so this we've been working on. This is a painting of a green habanero by Ruby. And so now as I advance the slide, we'll have an experience and we'll all see together a pepper that doesn't really exist yet. You probably saw a purple habanero. If you look to the side and then back, you'll see it's just a black and white. So it's a little optical trick to see something that hasn't yet been created to be able to look at, what could be, to think about how could you change things and what would it look like. For the artist, this is probably something that's very akin to what you're doing on a regular basis. For a lot of other people, though, this exercise is a stretch, right? So I said this didn't really exist yet, but Ruby's been an artist in residence in our plant breeding program and started to look at what could she create that was along the lines of this purple pepper. And so Ruby's creations, in a form of generative art, they span a lot of diversity, a lot of variation. So here, she's introduced the purple through a cross-pollination with a purple pepper into all these habanero types. And you can see all the different ways purple manifests as the pepper interprets those instructions to make the purple anthocyanin pigment with all of its other genetics. And since they're all different, they interpret it differently. And you see purple differently in these peppers. Okay. And even if you've seen the false color after images before, if it's new to you, great, but if you've seen it before, one of the things that I wanted to use that for is as we inverted the colors there, one of the other things that Ruby's discovered is that she can actually invert the colors differently in the pepper. So usually anthocyanins form as a sunscreen pigment on the outside of a fruit. The blueberries and grapes, much of that pigment is in the skin. It's usually like as a sunscreen, as an indicator to seed dispersers to come and find them. This is part of an approach that we're starting to work on, a metabolic painting, where we can try to see if we can get different parts of the plant to express those chemistries and be able to map where different compounds are made. It is also something that I wasn't really sure we could do. Ruby found a way where this is just inverting which tissues in the plant are normally making the color. To do this, it was combining some very different genetics from some very different members of the species. And in creating them, it creates a whole new level of diversity. We're getting phenotypes that didn't exist in either of the parents. Neither of them were purple on the inside. This one is. So the point there in just kind of seeing this is there's so much we have yet to learn about genetic diversity. There's so much we have yet to learn about where we're going. It's so important to hold on to everything we can as we go forward into the future. So it's an important resource. We have the social aspects of it, the intrinsic and ecological values of holding on to diversity. I'm looking at it as some elements that I play with as my lens onto finding joy in genetic diversity, and then the lead into the narratives of the people that have worked with these before. And so art is a great way to be able to partner in the conservation of this genetic diversity. And I would say, as we try to envision the future that we're working toward, what does agriculture and sustainability look like? Where are we going together? Art can be a fantastic lens to help us paint a vision of the future that we're hoping to achieve. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you all, and I'm going to introduce Susan Minton, who is going to, she's been monitoring the Q&A, and she'll ask a few questions.
Okay, all right. Shall I wait for my image to come up? No? Okay, all right. Good evening, everyone. Well, it's evening for me. I'm Susan Minton, and I'm coming to you from southeastern Pennsylvania, which is on the east coast of the United States, but wherever you are, welcome. And I hope you'll enjoy the conference. Every one of those presentations was fascinating. So let's get to some of your questions. A couple were for Alex, and I'd like to ask him to respond to this. Someone asked Alex if you would elaborate on the relationship between beets and chard.
Mm-hmm. Sure thing. Botanically, they're the same species, but one has been selected intensively for its above ground stalks and leaves, and the other was selected historically over the course of hundreds and if not thousands of years for its fleshy taproot. So it's similar to the story that Dr. Mazurek told of independent squash domestications, where you had a wild plant that someone noticed or a group of people noticed, and there was an opportunity to improve the roots by saving the seeds often of the plants that produce the largest and allowing those to cross-pollinate with each other, or by finding plants that had exceptionally vigorous leafy growth and saving the seeds from those. And over time, you concentrate those traits in a population. So like with the Apios Americana, the groundnut, the Dr. Blackman began with thousands of wild selections and kept only the few that had the largest roots. Those were then cross-pollinated, and so their offspring emphasize the genetics that improve the root size. So the more of those combinations you make, the more of any one trait you can emphasize. So I'm not an expert on the domestication of beets or chard, but that's the general outline of how they can be the same species of plant and still able to cross-pollinate. It's sort of like different varieties of tomatoes. Instead of different colors, they were selected for different plant parts.
So could you eat the roots of chard?
Yep. In our experience, they tend to be woody unless you grow a really big chard stalk, but they are edible.
Okay. And another question that you answered in the chat for the person who answered it or who asked it, but I think that it would be good to answer it for everyone because I'm sure there are others who are interested. The question was, can any of the new pawpaws that have been developed withstand the heat and humidity of the coastal Southeast United States?
Yes, to the best of my knowledge, they are native to the Southeast as well. I don't have any personal experience with friends foraging down that way, but I know in the maps of where pawpaws are distributed, they do grow in Florida in the wild. So I'd imagine that most, if not all, the selections would be just as hardy in that climate, because some crops like apples, when they've been bred for a long period of time, lose some of the resilience of the wild plant communities because humans are substituting fertilizers or pesticides or irrigation to supplement what the roots or the fruits are not able to produce anymore. But as far as I know, with pawpaws, the growers that we know and communicate with have not had issues in the South with diseases and pests and heat and so forth. So I think the answer is yes, but it might be good to double check with Extension or some of the local resources.
Great. Okay.
Could I add,
The next question, it was addressed
Susan,
to
could
Michael.
I add something on top of that?
Sure, yeah.
I just wanted to mention it. If anybody wants a really long-term project, so the center of diversity for that group of plants, the Asamina group, which pawpaws are in, is really Florida. And so there's a bunch of wild relatives, I think 7 or 8 species down there. And so if you want to domesticate a new species of pawpaw for us, let us know, or let our grandchildren know, and it'll be a great service. Thanks.
That sounds really promising. The next question was addressed to Michael, but I think that any of you might be able to answer it. And I'm sure that this is something that is on a lot of people's minds. How does your work address and ensure looking for possible downsides of genetic manipulations that might be problematic? And some folks are very wary of GMOs, and how does that play into the work that you all do?
And so I think in the work I do, the work I described, what I'm doing is cross-pollination. It's the same thing that's been done for thousands of years, and the same thing that the bees will do in your garden, just with less intention, or different intentions rather. Their intention is the honey and the pollen. So toward that, it's a very different sort of genetic manipulation. And I think for me, I'm still very much focused in this area, viewing it as a more powerful form. There's much of the approaches that I think people have heard of tend to be very simplified, where it's moving one gene into maybe a very different place. For me, and the beauty of the genetic diversity we have and the power of crossing things together is I'm recombining different forms of 20, 30, 40,000 different genes. And it's not stuff that I've had to figure out exactly how it works, or mostly how it works, discover the gene for something. I'm working with the great unknown. There are things where we can be very predictive and scientific and learn more and more about what's going to happen. But we also, like I showed that last pepper photo, going out to the field, there's always this element of surprise. I'm going to learn something new. I'm going to discover something new that I can then hand off to one of my science colleagues that's more focused on getting down to the nitty gritty of how something works. And then we have these great collaborations and partnerships that arise as a result. But for the approaches I have, it's things that could be going on in your garden anyway, and we eat a lot of what we grow before it ever ends up in a seed packet.
That's a great answer, Michael, and I wish more people understood that as a reality and didn't have such knee-jerk reactions to something that they think is scary and may not be. Carol, how are we doing on time?
We can take one more question.
One more question? Okay. Then I think I'll go to this one, and maybe each of the 4 of you could give one brief answer to this. And the question is, which plant would you most like to see illustrated to help tell your story? You want to start with in the order that we want? You want to go to Colin first?
Oh, goodness. Well, thank you for the most incredibly difficult question one could ask. I am going to vote for Apios Americana, and I'm going to let Alex answer why. But this is a truly incredible plant that is just under-recognized in the world.
Okay, if Apios is claimed, then I think I'd say Brassica rapa and the Mizunas and turnips and just brassicas in general, because there's so many unique selections from around the world and so many possibilities to shuffle those genes together and select for things like winter hardiness and disease resistance, and define niches on farms that could offer an earlier crop for farmers or a crop out of season. So thinking about fall and what's growing now, that's what I would say, but it's an incredibly hard question to answer.
All right, well, I have an answer and then I have a asterisk to my answer. So I would love to see illustrations of the rock grape, Vitis rupestris. This is a rare species in Missouri. It's called the rock grape because it grows on gravel beds. So imagine, it literally grows on rocks. And for that reason, it's been a target of breeding for grapevine rootstocks. So my asterisk is that the illustration has to take into account the whole plant, both above ground and below ground. And this is something that is totally underrepresented in botanical art, but also in science, because it's just so hard to study and so hard to see. So I would love to see an expansion of work focused on the below ground half of plants. And I would start with Vitis rupestris.
And I would say, rather than me picking it, I would love to be introduced to something new, and then with an idea of what someone would like changed about it. And that's what I do. But I think I love being introduced to something new and why it's special, and the narrative to why it's special, and then try to see if there's a way that I can contribute to that story with a cross.
Well,
Great, thank you. I'll turn it back over to Carol.
Thank you all so much. You've given us so much to think about. I've learned a lot tonight, and you've given us things to think about, both about the food we eat and also about the work that we do. And we really appreciate the work that you're all doing, both to benefit us now and to benefit people who come after us. So it's been terrific to have you all, and thank you.